War and military intervention and imperialism are not just about access to natural resources and geopolitics. Those are one of the main factors, but it's also about preventing countries that are anti-hegemonic, anti-systemic from creating alternatives.
A few minutes into the video, we can already see that the creator of that video has a warped way of understanding geopolitical situations as well as the ideological situations that exist within a country. On the right of his video, that is the creator that made that video, we see that there's a journalist who's part of an organization called the Gray Zone. On the left, we see the 1989 protests in Tiananmen Square in the People's Republic of China. Now, when we look at the left, we can see that the face of that journalist is on the tank. And what he is saying is that since he has slightly or highly positive views of the PRC, then that means everything he says does not deserve to have a voice. He is supposedly traitorous, supposedly stupid, supposedly all these other terms. This video is a response to someone called Nightmare Fuel. Nightmare Fuel is a neoconservative / neoliberal that supports everything the United States and NATO or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization does in the world. He has no problems with supporting war and conflict when it benefits the international organizations that fit into his primitive and reductionist understanding of politics.
Back at it again with a doozy. Now, guys and gals, it's well known that I am a masochist. I regret to inform you that I am also a sadomasochist, so I will be sharing with you this strange torture porn that apparently I get a kick out of. You're welcome. Here we have Gray Zone contributor Tanky Ben Norton. I've briefly mentioned him in past videos. In terms of his other work, it doesn't fucking matter. Really. These anti-interventionist types are a dime a dozen NPCs who may as well have been made in a Chinese factory, for all I care. See, that's a funny joke, because Ben Norton is an apologist for the CCP. Huh? Pretty good?
No.
Tough room. Let's run his word salad back a bit, shall we?
War and military intervention and imperialism are not just about access to natural resources and geopolitics. Those are one of the main factors, but it's also about preventing countries that are anti-hegemonic, anti-systemic from creating alternatives.
What a cavalcade of rehearsed bullshit, honestly. Keep in mind, he specifically mentioned that the countries he's about to name are anti-hegemonic and anti-systemic. Whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. Talk about pseudo-intellectualism 101.
It is very fascinating that you have this type of morality that is so simplistic, so low quality in how it's supposed to be implemented. It sounds like a type of narcissistic urge that you're trying to bring up. When you accuse your enemy of being someone that encourages word salad, then I think that the true anti-intellectual is rather you. When you accuse others of being pseudo-intellectuals, I see that as being an attempt to make you feel like your dogmatic views are better than everyone else, that you alone know the truth.
When he lists these countries, don't forget that description. Be honest with us, Ben. The rogue nations you're about to go to bat for are anti-American hegemony. That doesn't necessarily mean they aren't in favor of a different hegemonic setup. Many such nations are also for certain leaders or certain political parties having an unchallenged hegemonic control over their own affairs.
I like how you try to just pound your moralistic views to your audience. You expect them to just accept everything you say, and that is actually true, because when you look at the comment sections of Nightmare Fuel, you will usually see comments with one sentence saying how good he is, with no one questioning why he's right or wrong. And to just look at how he actually justifies everything, you will see a very simplistic or reductionist way of saying how things ought to be, or how we ought to behave in terms of foreign policy. When you look at this paragraph right in front of your face, that is, if you can see, and I expect everyone to see this, is that the US is not an angel. The US government has done negative things throughout the world, not only in its domestic policies, but it has also done things outside its borders. For example, the United States supported Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy with no elections, no multi-party system, not even free speech, and is supported by the United States. If America really cared about democracy across the world, it wouldn't support these dictatorships like Saudi Arabia or what exists in many Middle Eastern nations, or what exists in South America like Pinochet. The United States wouldn't support the Saudi war that is penetrating the borders of Yemen. In this paragraph, we can see that there's allegedly a war crime done by the Saudis, and it's not crazy to assume that they have done many more war crimes in Yemen under the guidance of the United States and NATO. Not only that, but we also have accusations in Afghanistan of US troops causing a war crime in the region. And the United States blocked any investigation of these events. If the United States has so much power to sway how international organizations investigate certain supposed injustices done to the people of the world, then think of how many more things our military and our leaders have done to secure the illusion of a free, open-minded democracy. Why would the United States of America boycott an international organization looking to see if war crimes were committed in a certain country in which US troops exist? Not only this, but actual war criminals have been pardoned by the United States. Our government is supposed to be a democracy that wants to show how good it is to the rest of the world. If it cannot actually do this, then does it really deserve to have so much power over the sovereignty of nations? When we look at countries like Iraq, countries in which the United States already intervened, we can see that they have not even got any democracies. If our government really cared about spreading our liberal Western democracies across the world, then why do we have Iraqi soldiers shooting protesters in Baghdad and other cities in the country? Not only this, but the government in Iraq also censored information on these protests. In this next paragraph, you will also see that the Iraqi government also has caused several other human rights violations against citizens, using torture against adults and children, and the government also has not actually given fair trials to its citizens.
From Iraq to Panama, George H.W. Bush was responsible for countless deaths. Far from being the moderate voice of reason he is now being presented as in the era of Trumpism, he was an elite custodian of capitalism and empire. In 1989, the administration of the newly inaugurated President Bush invaded the tiny Central American nation of Panama in order to oust dictator Manuel Noriega, who had himself been a longtime CIA asset, who for years worked closely with the United States, helping it to fund right-wing death squads while he was trafficking drugs. The U.S. brutally bombed Panama, burning down thousands of homes, leading to the nickname Little Hiroshima. Historian Greg Grandin noted that the bodies of dead Panamanians were shoveled into mass graves. But Bush's bloodiest atrocities were yet to come. In August 1990, Iraq militarily occupied and annexed its southern neighbor Kuwait. The Bush administration wanted a war in response, and in order to sell this war, it spread blatant lies. In October 1990, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl testified before the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus and claimed,
"While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying."
Human rights organizations like Amnesty International obediently echoed this myth, and George H.W. Bush used it to justify a war on Iraq.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
It was only after this war, in 1992, that it was revealed that this 15-year-old girl was actually the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S., and that the lies she spread had been orchestrated by a PR firm on behalf of the Kuwaiti monarchy. But remember, Bush had declared just a few years ago that he didn't care what the facts are. In 1991, the 41st U.S. president launched a war on Iraq, and it was extremely brutal. Under Bush's leadership, the U.S. military deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, devastating the country. Just weeks after the end of the war, the United Nations published a survey analyzing the civilian damage done by U.S. bombing. The UN found that Iraq was, quote, near apocalyptic, that it had been bombed back, quote, to a pre-industrial age, and that the country was on the verge of a, quote, epidemic and famine. The U.S. military also used depleted uranium weapons in Iraq, leading to birth defects, high cancer rates, and environmental damage that Iraqis are still suffering from to this day. Even the Washington Post, which supported the war, acknowledged 4 months after it that the U.S. and its allies, quote, sought to achieve some of their military objectives in the Persian Gulf War by disabling Iraqi society at large. And the U.S., quote, deliberately did great harm to Iraq's ability to support itself as an industrial society. Precision-guided weapons were used to specifically target electrical plants, oil refineries, and the transportation grid. The U.S. destroyed more than 100 bridges, along with roads, railroads, factories, phone networks, and TV and radio stations. The Pentagon later admitted that it intentionally demolished Iraq's electricity infrastructure, reducing the country's power generation level after the war by 96%, knocking it back to the level that Iraq had in 1920. A lieutenant general told the Washington Post that the psychological impacts that average Iraqi citizens would suffer from after losing their electricity was a, quote, side benefit. One of the most extreme U.S. crimes was committed on February 13, 1991, when the military used laser-guided smart bombs to destroy a shelter full of civilians. 408 Iraqi civilians were massacred in this U.S. attack, and the Pentagon itself admitted that the Amaria shelter that it bombed was being used by civilians seeking protection. Even more blood-curdling was an atrocity that was so heinous it earned the name the Highway of Death. On February 26th and 27th,
the US and allies Britain, France, and Canada bombed Iraqi soldiers as they tried to flee Kuwait and return to Iraq. Thousands of fleeing Iraqis were massacred. There were even reportedly some civilians among the soldiers as they tried to flee, including foreign workers and Palestinians who were expelled by the Kuwaiti monarchy. They were all bombed to pieces. Thousands died. The exact number of victims is unknown. The aftermath of the Gulf War was beyond catastrophic. A Harvard public health team investigated and found that Iraq had acute malnutrition and epidemic levels of the preventable diseases cholera and typhoid. The Harvard team also estimated that at least 170,000 Iraqi children under age 5 would die in the year after the war due to the effects of the US bombing. The Washington Post noted, quote, "Planners now say their intent was to destroy or damage valuable facilities that Baghdad could not repair without foreign assistance. The Bush administration deliberately made the lives of millions of Iraqis complete hell to try to force them into such desperation that they would overthrow their leader." And even when the 1991 Gulf War ended, the Bush 41 administration's war on Iraqi society continued. The U.S. used the United Nations Security Council to expand crippling sanctions on Iraq, which banned all trade with the country. These sanctions, which were further continued under subsequent President Bill Clinton, led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children and other civilians. In response to these reports of mass civilian devastation from U.S. bombing, George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, insisted that every target was, quote, perfectly legitimate. He declared, quote, "If I had to do it over again, I would do exactly the same thing." Bush Sr.'s Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney would go on to become Bush Jr.'s vice president, and the brains behind George W. Bush's foreign policy and his own second war on Iraq a decade later. Moreover, H.W. Bush's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, later served as W. Bush's Secretary of State. Given the overlap between Bush 41's administration and that of Bush 43, it is no surprise that Bush Jr. followed in his father's footsteps, launching another devastating war in the Middle East, which destabilized the region and led to more than 1 million deaths. These crimes fly directly in the face of the corporate media's portrayal of George H.W. Bush as a principled moderate. The real Bush left behind a murderous legacy, full of war crimes across the planet. For the Real News Network, I'm Ben Norton.
Obviously, that goes to explain why they don't like the United States challenging their power. I couldn't even tell you what anti-systemic is supposed to mean in this context. I'll chalk it up to SJW buzzword nonsense. Is there a nation on this planet that is not, quote, systemic? How would that even be possible?
Iran, Venezuela, the former Workers' Party government in Brazil, the Correa government in Ecuador, even the more slightly left-leaning but not great government in India, they were all committed to creating a new economic system, and they were integrated into what was known as the BRICS system. The Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa system. They were trying to create a new global financial system that could challenge the World Bank and the IMF.
Apparently, all those governments and political parties are anti-hegemonic and anti-systemic. I'm still not letting that characterization go. How unfortunate for Ben Norton, truly. All these developing nations pooled their resources in an attempt to challenge the evil capitalist U.S. empire, and it doesn't appear to have gone very well. I mean, just look at what he listed here. Brazil, Ecuador, India. Those countries all now have leadership that is cooperative with us. And as soon as we get off our asses and overthrow the adversarial governments in Iran and Venezuela, I will happily rub that in your face as well. Did you all notice his discomfort when mentioning the Indian government? That was strange. Out of the entire list, that was the only example that seemingly made him squeamish. I don't really have a further comment on that. I just thought it was weird.
The government of India is led by a ultra-nationalistic leader that wishes to turn his country into a theocracy under the rule of Hinduism. The government has shut down the internet several times, as well as phone calls of those it accuses of not actually being aligned with the government. And also, India has faced mob violence, in which Hindus have lynched and killed many Muslims and many other ethnicities and religions that do not fit in what they see as the perfect society. The legislative branch of the government in India actually passed a law that allowed the government to strip away citizenship of those that it does not like. Now, viewer, keep in mind that Modi is supported by the United States. Modi is a friend of America. Brazil is even in a more worse situation, especially under the rule of their leader named Jair Bolsonaro. He is the type of person that wants to be a dictator. Bolsonaro does not only support dictatorship, he also supports the actions of various regimes within South America. Plus, Bolsonaro also believes in too much conspiracy theories.
Eu sou favorável à tortura, tu sabe disso. O povo, a sociedade brasileira não gosta de homossexual. A cultura é diferente da nossa. Agora, nós não estamos preparados ainda, no Brasil, porque nem um pai, nem você, nem eu, tem orgulho de ter um filho gay. Orgulho, prazer, fazer festa, porque apareceu um filho gay na família.
If the child is happy.
Isso, porque o filho começa a ficar meio assim, meio gayzinho, leva um couro, ele muda o comportamento dele. Tá certo?
Se seu filho se apaixonasse por uma negra, o que você faria?
Ô, Preta, eu não vou discutir promiscuidade com quem quer que seja. Eu não corro esse risco, que meus filhos foram muito bem educados. Eu fui num quilombola em Eldorado Paulista. O afrodescendente mais leve lá pesava 7 arrobas. Não fazem nada. Eu acho que nem para procriadores serve mais. Jamais eu estou para você que você não merece.
Olha, eu espero que não.
Se é esse, eu falo. Dá, eu te dou outra. Dá que 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 eu te dou outra.
Mas o que é isso?
Você me chamou de estuprador? Você me chamou de estuprador? Você é imoral. Tá, vagabunda?
Mas o que é isso? O que é isso aqui?
Now, viewer, remember that Bolsonaro is supported by the United States. Do you really think that as an American or as a Westerner that you would actually want your government to support such a man like this? Nightmare Fuel rallies against dictatorships. He supposedly believes he is doing that. He is supposedly thinking that he really cares about Western values that are in his mind liberal Western bourgeoisie democracies. But how can this be true when he has the interest of supporting those that have no problem with destroying liberal democracies? He does not hate dictatorships as long as they are pro-American and pro-imperialist, because these countries do not care about anything that America values, do not care about civil liberties or what you will call human rights. Neoconservatives like this YouTuber are hypocrites. In a way, he is a true supporter of rogue states, because he has no problem when countries like the United States breaks international laws.
So it's not even just the resources, it's the so-called threat that these independent countries, not just socialist countries, but even countries like Iran, pose to the US and European dominated international financial system, which is the way that imperialism, aside from military force, that's the most blunt instrument, but the other instruments are the Bretton Woods system. This is the system by which imperialism maintains its international chokehold through the use of the dollar, forcing countries to do international trade in the dollar, to sell their oil in the dollar.
Allow me to translate that for those of you not versed in anti-imperialist NPC speak. International trade is done with US dollars because the US economy is the most powerful and stable economic system on the planet. Yes, even during COVID. Plus, it's just handy to have a universal currency when it comes to that. Ben Norton doesn't like that situation because Ben Norton is anti-American. It really is as simple as that. The political vision of a coalition such as BRICS is to create a multipolar world economically, or as I would call it, fractured. He's been doing this throughout the clip, but I love how casually he throws around the word imperialism. Notice what he's trying to accomplish with this rhetoric. He is trying to exclusively associate the idea of imperialism with actions that bolster and strengthen the United States. Be mindful of that. I wonder if Ben Norton has ever been in favor of any nation expanding their influence either through military force or diplomacy. Because if he has, then he is by definition an imperialist, and a very self-hating one at that.
There is no problem with the concept of a multipolar world. Nightmare Fuel does not like other countries expressing their freedoms. He does not like other countries having peaceful solutions, that is, diplomatic solutions to world problems. If you really cared about international law and international cooperation and transnational organizations like the European Union, you would support a multipolar world. And it should be clear that is throughout history, when one group or one individual or anything that is just a single version of everything else, is that given one thing so much responsibility can cause corruption. Now, when we focus on the US dollar, we must realize that the United States prints too much money. There's too much inflation in the economy. So, if the US dollar actually controls everything, and if there is inflation, is there really a stable currency?
But the other instruments are the Bretton Woods system. This is the system by which imperialism maintains its international chokehold through the use of the dollar, forcing countries to do international trade in the dollar, to sell their oil in the dollar, and then forcing them to take loans from the IMF, and then the IMF and the World Bank impose structural adjustment, which forces them to open up their economies to Western capital and privatize everything. That
right,
and
it forces right, and
oh no, how nefarious. The IMF provides loans to lift nations out of poverty or strengthen their economic stability, and gasp! They eventually expect to be paid back. That's kind of how a loan works. It's almost like money doesn't grow on trees, almost like they need to keep their pockets lined if they're going to continue being in the business of giving out loans. Norton also complained about structural adjustment. I'll translate that as well. Structural adjustment has been routinely criticized for its pro-free market bias. In exchange for economic aid, there can sometimes be an expectation that the country being aided makes adjustments to its economy that will help ensure that the IMF or World Bank aid goes to good use, and this process won't have to repeat itself sooner than later. Ben Norton takes issue with that because it puts poor socialist nations in a position where they'd have to implement capitalist elements in their respective economies. Look, Ben, I'm sorry that your precious economic philosophy so often fails to produce economic growth or economic stability, but that sounds like a personal problem. Oh, and of course I should mention we now have to hear from Rania Khalek, as if Ben wasn't bad enough on his own. Rania, sadly, is a notable personality in anti-US empire circles, and she produces propaganda videos for the Kremlin. That's not a joke. Do what you will with that information.
My biggest question for Nightmare Fuel is what kind of planet you live on. Because on where I live, that is the planet Earth, I see more poverty, more crime on the world, and more exploitation than anything you claim. The IMF does not actually help anyone. The IMF actually creates a false version of hope upon poor nations across the world, and then it stabs all that opportunity and steals all that wealth back. Or this, in a certain way, it just lets everything collapse upon itself. For example, in Mexico, they got some loans and then they collapse. If this is a success story, if this is a story of how powerful neoliberal capitalism is, then I must say I am amazed by how stupid the IMF is. We also have a whole bunch of examples in Asia that ended up the same way as Mexico. They all collapsed and had their own economic decline. Notice that so far all these examples are capitalist countries. There's no socialism here. Socialism is not even that common in the world. And you can see that neoconservatives and neoliberals like to smash the leftists with all these straw mans and these assumptions of the world. They do not even know what geopolitics are. They do not even understand what real politics are. And they may pretend to know what it is. And they will say, this is realism, this is realism, this is realism because it is realism. They do not actually explain anything in detail. Oh, and let's not forget about Greece. Greece had some economic decline too. And guess what happened? They voted in a left-wing party. And that was after the IMF caused the country to become poor. Here is an important tip for rightists and capitalists and all those other people. If you do not want communism to happen or socialism to happen, then do not lead the country into the direction of market crashes. It doesn't really matter anyways because you're gonna fail regardless of what happens.
But wait, there's more.
Before America bombed Yugoslavia with uranium bombs, the same thing literally happened with Yugoslavia as it did with the rest of the world after the Cold War. If you were actually honest, you will realize that neoliberalism has done everything that anti-communists accuse communism of doing.
Wake me up inside.
I can't wake up.
Wake me up inside.
Save me.
Call my name and save me from the dark.
Wake me up.
Get my blood to run.
I can't wake up
before I come undone.
Save me.
Save me from the nothing guys that come.